Well, hello there. I have to take a break in like 20 minutes because I have bread in the oven. But here we go. Hi, Lily. How are you? How are you? This is the Reaper. I saw you just a couple of minutes ago. But yeah, I think I'm going to tell. I miss streaming now. I think I'm ready to start making a bit of a comeback. At least with streaming. I don't know about video making, but we're totally needing to get back into Ooblets because Ooblets is freaking fun as hell. I don't care if it's popular anymore or not. I enjoyed it. And Spiritfarer, definitely. We're going to play some of the games that we used to play. I don't know how often we're going to play Sims, but I want to play other things too. Definitely make sure I keep with the variety because I like my variety. Definitely Planet Zoo, and I want to get that or the the what was I gonna say? The aquatic pack because there's penguins and there's river otters and there's things and I want them all. Mm-hmm. I don't dislike Sims, but I'm not. I don't think I'm ready to get back into Sims. You know what I mean? But I will at some point. But oh, how sweet! Tarn is such a doll. That was so nice. Um, yeah, because until we get a creature cage, I can't pull. I can't bring any animals. But we'll take care of that. But you know, we have all these really great games. We have Ostrov, which we really haven't done much with. We have Stardew Valley, Planet Zoo, Spiritfarer, which Kay gifted me months ago, and we were enjoying that so much. Ooblets, all sorts of things, and we will play Sims again. I think we might even restart my uh, building Gettysburg and history about that and stuff, all that, because I was enjoying doing that. Because it was a challenge. It was a complicated challenge. Definitely going to be building more because I love building so much. All right. So let's get started back into things. We finished the first chapter, which is generally the longest, aside from um, the second ghost. I don't know. We'll see how far we get today. I have a beverage, so I'm gonna have my beverage breaks. We're ready to go. My bread smells delicious. It's sourdough. Oh, my starter was perfect. It was ready to be used. It's gonna be delicious. Wait, that's not what I was doing. Come here. I want. Thank you. Okay, we asked on the first of three spirits. There's not really chapters in this book, more like parts. But, you know, it's an older book. It's what happens. It's what you do. And that's just how it's going to be. So, yeah, we have about 17 minutes until I need to take a quick break to get the bread out so it doesn't burn. Because burnt bread is disgusting. And I worked too hard on this bread to let it burn. It's literally going to be going to the oven, pulling the bread out, turning the oven off, coming back. That's it. Okay. The first of three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavouring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes, when the chimes of a neighbouring church struck the 4 quarters. He listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12. It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten to the works. 12. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. Why isn't it possible, said Scrooge, that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night? It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun. And this is 12 at noon. The idea of being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold. And there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if the night had beaten off bright day, and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of his first exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security, if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought, and thought, and thought, over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released, to its first position, and presented the same problems he worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more. Then he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously, and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong. 1/4 past, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong. 1/2 past, said Scrooge. Ding dong. 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong. The hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am to you now, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. Oh, remind me to upload last week's stream to my YouTube, if I forget, because I want that to stay there. In case someone should feel like rewatching this and missing whatever. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and of being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung around its neck and down his back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet were most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in a singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. And even this, I can't wait to see it. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it, with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered, now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at one time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, with now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body. Of dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and the very wonder of this, it would be of itself again distinct and clever as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to thee?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if, instead of being so close behind him, it were at distance. "Who? And what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if any one could have asked him. But he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What!" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of its life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise, and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing-gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am mortal," Scrooge remonstrated. "I am liable to fall." "There, but a touch of my hand, there," and the spirit laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields. On either hand the city entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was clear, cold, winter day, with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together, as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice. It was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervour. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let's go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies were seen trotting towards them, with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten, and his heart leapt up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas, as they parted at crossroads and byways, for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good has it ever done him? "This school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew about it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock surmounted on a cupola, on the roof, with a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of the broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, the gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach-houses and sheds were run over with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within for entering the jury hall, and glancing upon the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthy savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. "I will be right back. I'm going to go check on my bread and take it out of the oven." I have returned. For a few minutes more, I took the top off. Of the bread. Or, I put another bread pan over top because it helps with the oven spring. And then I take it off and let it cook a little bit longer because by the time I do that, it's still kind of moist and wet on the inside since it's a moist dough. Because, uh, okay. Anyway, it's sourdough. It's touchy. But worth it. It just needs a few more minutes. So probably about 10 or 15 minutes. The non-latent echo. In the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed water spout. In the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar. Not the idle swing of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm, and pointed to his younger self upon his reading, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba! Yes, yes, I know! When Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come. For the first time, just like that, poor boy. And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, asleep, at the gate of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serves him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects in a most extraordinary voice, between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends, in the city indeed. There's the parrot, green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out of the top of his head. There he is, poor Robinson Crusoe, he called him. And when he came home again, after sailing round the island, poor Robinson Crusoe, where have you been, Robinson Crusoe? The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There he goes, Friday, running as for his life, to the little creek. Hurrah, hoop, halloo! Then the rapidity of transition, very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity for his former self. Poor boy, he cried again. I wish, Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket, and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. But it's too late now. What's the matter? Asked the spirit. Nothing, said Scrooge, nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something, that's all. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, Let us see another Christmas. Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked lath was shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that he was alone again. when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and putting her arms round his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as, "Dear, dear brother!" "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands, and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home! Home! Home!" "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home for good and all. For home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home is like heaven. He spoke so gently to me. One dear night when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more, if you might come home. And he said yes, you should, and he sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're going to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and are never to come back here, but first we're to be together all Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world." "Oh, you're quite a woman, little Fan!" exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people at the same time, sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the post-boy, who came that he thanked the gentleman, and if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not Master Scrooge's trunk. Being by this time tied on the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye, right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, and the quick wheels dashing the hoar frost and snow from off the leaves of the evergreens like spray. "Always a delicate creature, with a breath, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost, "but she had a large heart." "So she did," cried Scrooge. "You're right. I will not gainsay it. Spirit, God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children?" "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, "Yes." Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were, which was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops, that here, too, it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door, and asked if Scrooge knew it. "Know it?" said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." They went in, at the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cries in excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart! The Fezziwig is alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock and pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capricious waistcoat, and laughed all over himself, from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo there, Ebenezer, Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas Eve, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3, had them up in all their places. 4, 5, 6, barred them and pinned them. 7, 8, 9, he came back before you have got to 12, panting like racehorses. Hiley-ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with a wonderful agility. Clear away! My lads, let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer! Clear away? There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was snug and warm and dry and bright. A ballroom, as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and turned like 50 stomach aches. Oh, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from the next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing and pulling. They went. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning back in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they all got there. All the top couples at last was not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig clapped his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again. But there were no dances yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there was minced pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you and I could have told him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. All right. Quick break for bread. I break for bread. That needs to be a bumper sticker. It's going to happen. Okay. BRB. still not quite done yet. But then the breaks, man. It's the middle of. It's like early evening, so I'm baking bread for the week. So, welcome to my life. But there are much worse things I could be doing. Mr. Fezziwig's Ball. Next part. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and became upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took the stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired, but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which are under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in scene with his former self, and he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folk so full of gratitude." "Small," echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices who were pouring their hearts in the praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, or pleasure or toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What's the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think?" the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed his passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall, he was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a morning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters to me," she said, softly, "to you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer you and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? He rejoined. A golden one. This is the even-handed dealing of the world, he said. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much, she answered gently. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? He retorted. Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. She shook her head. Am I? Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy, he said impatiently. Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are, she returned. I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this. I will not say it is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought release? In words? No, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope at its great end, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us, said the girl, looking mildly, but with steadiness upon him, tell me, you would seek me out and try to win me now? No. He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition, in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, You think not? I would gladly think otherwise if I could, she answered. Heaven knows, when I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be, but if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can I even believe? Can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You who, in your very confidence with her, weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you are false enough to your one guiding principle. To do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. You may. The memory of what is past, half makes me hope that you will have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly, as an unprofitable dream, from which it all happened. Well, that your work. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me? One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. No more, cried Scrooge. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more. But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like that last that Scrooge believed it was the same until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room were perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there. Then Scrooge, in his agitated state of mind, could count, and unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, there were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What would I not have given to be one of them? Though I never could have been so rude, no. No! I wouldn't for the wealth of all the world have crushed that braided hair, and torn it down, and for the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked off, God bless my soul, to save my life, as to measuring her waist in sport, as they did, bold young brood. I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round it for punishment, and never come straight again. And yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves of hair, an inch of which would be a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet to have been man enough to know its value. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she with laughing face and plundered dress was borne towards it at the centre of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught was made of the defenceless porter, the scaling him with chairs for ladders to dive into his pockets, to spoil him with brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hung him round his neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received, the terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into his mouth, and was more than suspected of swallowed a fictitious turkey, glued on a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding this a false alarm, the joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they are all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlour, and by one stair at a time up to the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever. When the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his side, at his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I, Tut? Don't I know?" she added in the same breath, laughing as she laughed. "Mr. Scrooge." "Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear. And there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe." "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face, in which in some strange way there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no longer!" In this struggle, if it can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of his adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connected that with its influence over him. He seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel it to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. The second of three spirits. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again established a sharp lookout all round the bed, for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plumed themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, expressed the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide, comprehensive range of subjects, without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this. I do not mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he laid upon his bed at the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which being only light was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at. It was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it was always the person, not the predicament, who knows that ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and the secret of this ghostly light might be the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation, as the walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, and as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or many a winter season gone, heaped up on the floor, to form a kind of throne, where turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with a delicious steam. In an easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in the shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light upon Scrooge as it came peeking through the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man!" Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare on its head. It wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard with no sword in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. BRB checking on bread. Again. This is how it works. We know this. Okay, I've returned, and we're going to finish up this chapter. And then next Sunday, I don't know, when the fuck is Christmas? I don't know anything about anything. I don't know anything about no dates, about nothing. I know it's on the 25th. Jeez, people. It is perfect. And then next Sunday, which will be the 20th, you'll finish this up, which is the perfect day to end it. I timed it just right, which was my plan. Because I like to finish the last couple of chapters on the week of Christmas, which is truly the only way to do it. If you cannot make it the ending on Christmas, you want to do it the week of. Perfect timing. Excellent. Okay, cool beans. Scrooge's third visitor. I don't know why I show it to you. You can't see it. Light. Just so you can like look at my face for some reason. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but alright. Go with it. Oh, Lily, tell your mother you need to watch the mail at some point. Probably next week. Because I got something in, I'm going to have something in the mail just for you, but it's a surprise. And for your mom. And for Bunny. I think you'll like it. Something special for my special bookworm. You're gonna love it. I'm not gonna tell you what it is. It's a surprise. But it's purple. You're gonna dig it. Anyway, let's get back to the book. Scrooge's third visitor. You have never seen the like of me before, exclaimed the spirit. Never. Scrooge made answer to it. Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these later years? Pursued the phantom. I don't think I have, said Scrooge. I am afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, spirit? More than 1,800, said the ghost. A tremendous family to provide for, muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. Spirit, said Scrooge submissively, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson, which is working now. Tonight, if you ought to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where for the weather was severe, the people made a rough and brisk and not unpleasant kind of music. In scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the tops of the houses, whence it was mad delight to the boy to see it plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked with the dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty storms, sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had by one constant caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the clearest summer air and the brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shovelling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now, in exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missiled far than many a wordly jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. They were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like waistcoats of jolly gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in the apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from the shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes, made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling their fragrance, ancient walks among the woods, and pheasant shufflings ankle-deep with withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squat and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the orange and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant blood race, appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping around and round the little world in slow, passionless excitement. The grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down. But through those gaps, such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, all that the blended scents of tea and coffee was so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, and the other spices so delicious, the candied fruit so caked and spotted with molten sugar, as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it the figs were moist and pulpy, and that the French plums blushed in their modest topknots from the highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crossing their whisker baskets wildly, and left the purchases upon the counter and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of little mistakes in the best humour possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection for Christmas dolls to peck at if they so choose. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces, and at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people, carrying the dinners to bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as the bearers passed, sprinkled incense upon their dinners from his torch. It was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled with each other, and their good humour was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was, God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners in progress of the cooking, in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. "Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is. My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. to any kindly given, to a poor one most. Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought. I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds, about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. I, cried the spirit. You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day of which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge, wouldn't you? I, cried the spirit. You seek to close these places on the seventh day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek? Exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us as all our kith and kin, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. Perhaps it was the pleasure of the good spirit had showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk's. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly, in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap, and make a goodly show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons. While Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honour of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled goose, and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. These young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his colours nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother Tiny Tim and Martha weren't it as late last Christmas?" "By half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother!" cried 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are!" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times. And taking off her shawl and bonnet, with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye." "No, no, there's father coming," cried the two Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes donned up and brushed, to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming!" said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day!" Martha didn't like to seem disappointed, if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door, and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as Bob, or as good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself, so much, and thinks the strangest things you had ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told him this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. And old Bob was turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby. Compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in a high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and, in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple-sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting their guards upon their posts, crammed their spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. At the last it was succeeded by a breathless pause, and Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one moment of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, cried feebly, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness, were the themes of universal admiration, eked out by apple-sauce and mashed potatoes. It was a sufficient dinner for the whole family, indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit sat upon with great delight. Surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular. They were steeped in sage and onion to the brows. But now the plates were being changed by Miss Belinda. Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and to bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got all over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. It smelled like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannon-ball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wondrous pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, at what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one. And at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff in the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest that he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if, man, you be in heart not adamant forbear, that wicked can't, until you have discovered what surplus is and what it is, will you decide what men shall live, and what man shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless, and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," she said, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do. Poor fellow." "My dear." And Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake, Not the days. And the days, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of the proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, and the mere relief of Scrooge and the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at that idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow, being a holiday, she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter. At which Peter pulled his collars up so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the checked nuts in the jug went round, and by. They had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. The shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchen parlours and all sorts of rooms were wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cosy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn shut out the coldness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, and aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, half of which is, well, they knew it, in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly family gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half-chimney high, blessings on it. And how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter, who ran on before, dotting the dusky street with specks of light, who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so but for the frost that held its prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furzy, and coarse rank grass. down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye frowning lower, lower, lower yet. Was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me. See!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round the glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in the holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigour sank again. The spirit did not tarry there, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped. Whither? Not to sea. To sea! To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, in frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water, as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine its earth, built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from the shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through. There stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, worn to the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here 2 men, who watched the light and made a fire through the loophole in the thick stone wall, shed out of a ray of brightness on the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat. They wished each other Merry Christmas, and their can of grog, and one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on until being far away. As he held Scrooge from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures, in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered that he had cared for at a distance those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darknesses of an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge. While thus engaged to hear a hearty laugh, it was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing, smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. And that is where we're going to leave off until next week, where we finish this book, The Week of Christmas. I hope you had a wonderful time. We've been going for a good hour and 41 minutes. It's not bad. Anyway, I'm going to go find some food because I'm hungry. And then I will be back in Worm with you, Reaper, in a little while. And I will go upload last week's thing, and I will set this VOD to upload. So I will see you later. I hope you had a great time. I hope you enjoyed the book so far, Lily. And I will talk to y'all later on. Be well. happy and peaceful. And I will see you. Doo-doo.